What happens when the son of one of the most notorious criminals in history decides to break free from his father's shadow? How does Sebastian Marroquin, formerly known as Juan Pablo Escobar, navigate the complex legacy left behind by the infamous drug lord Pablo Escobar? After years of silence, Escobar's son is finally ready to reveal the truth about his father. The Pablo Escobar suicide theory. In 1989, the Colombian government established the Search Block, a specialized police unit tasked with dealing with Pablo Escobar and his notorious cartel. With the collaborative efforts of agencies such as the CIA and the DEA, they relentlessly pursued Escobar, ultimately cornering him and bringing about his demise in a hail of gunfire on a Medellin rooftop. Officially, the Search Block took responsibility for Escobar's death, but shortly thereafter, reports began to circulate suggesting a different narrative. Some accounts indicated that Pablo Escobar had taken matters into his own hands literally by firing the fatal shot himself. This controversial twist in the story gained further credibility when Juan Pablo, Escobar's son, corroborated it in his book titled Pablo Escobar, My Father. According to Juan Pablo, his father had confided in him that he would resort to shooting himself in the right ear as a desperate measure to avoid capture. Juan Pablo asserts that his father's final moments were marked by a tragic act of self-inflicted death, but Colombian authorities concealed this truth. Surrounded by hundreds of soldiers with gunshot wounds to his shoulder and leg, Pablo Escobar found himself trapped on the rooftop of a secure Medellin hideout. In that dire moment, he allegedly placed his own Sig Sauer pistol to the right side of his head and pulled the trigger, as recounted by his son. The world remained unaware of the suicidal stand on December 3, 1993, because according to Juan Pablo, the coroner had been instructed not to challenge the sanctioned version of events, which portrayed the heroic Colombian forces as the ones responsible for ending the reign of the world's most formidable cocaine trafficker. Juan Pablo's belief regarding his father's death challenges long-standing beliefs about the circumstances surrounding his father's death. In fact, he said, "My father always told me that he had 15 bullets in his pistol. 14 were for his enemies, and the last one for him." He said this is not a mere theory. He even said, "Forensic investigators who performed the autopsy told us it was suicide, but that they were threatened by the authorities not to disclose the truth in their final report." Another basis lies in the lack of definitive evidence regarding who fired the fatal shot that ultimately ended Pablo Escobar's life on that fateful rooftop in Medellin, Colombia. This is primarily rooted in the nature of the gunshot wound that struck Pablo Escobar, which was located on the side of his head. In fact, in a series of interviews, he has reiterated his conviction that his father had taught him this method of self-inflicted harm during their years in hiding. These years were marked by relentless pursuits by both enemies and authorities. Pablo Escobar's motivation for instructing his son in this grim skill was clear: to ensure a foolproof means of avoiding the horrific torture and retribution that awaited him if he were to be captured by adversaries, such as the feared Cali Cartel. To Juan Pablo, the gunshot wound to the head was enough to serve as compelling evidence that his father chose to end his own life rather than fall into the hands of those who sought personal revenge, particularly groups like Los Pepes, seeking vengeance for the deaths of their loved ones at Escobar's command. He also remembered the last time he saw his father alive. Escobar shed tears as he bid farewell to the entire family, as though he had an ominous premonition that this would be the final time he would see them alive. Escobar's criminal journey. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, widely known as Pablo Escobar, was born on December 1, 1949, in Rio Negro, Colombia. Born into a family where his father, Abel de Jesus Dari Escobar, worked as a farmer, and his mother, Hermilda Gaviria, as a schoolteacher. Contrary to later stories, Escobar's childhood was not one of extreme poverty. His mother's teaching job set them apart, and when he was born, his father already owned a house, some land, and 6 cows. They had no electricity, but had running water, which made them upper middle class in rural Colombia. Hermilda, the teacher, was well respected in the community. After the family's relocation to the suburbs of Medellin, their quality of life notably improved. Things got even better in the more urbanized Envigado, where Pablo Escobar always appeared well-dressed and enjoyed ample meals. He shared many of the same interests as an average American boy his age, including music, movies, and fast food. His father secured a job as a watchman, though it's worth noting that city life may not have been entirely to his liking, as he would later return to rural work and remains notably absent from accounts of Pablo's life. Meanwhile, his mother continued her teaching career. However, despite the semblance of a conventional family existence, Colombia during Escobar's formative years was steeped in uncertainty and rampant violence. In Pablo Escobar's youth, his childhood heroes had names like Sangre Negra or Black Blood, Tiro Fijo or Sure Shot, Chispas or Sparks, and Desquite or Revenge. These stories taught him that power and notoriety came through violence, glamorizing crime, and avoiding the law. Escobar understood the impact of myth, much like how the legend of Robin Hood made a rebel a hero. Escobar grew up surrounded by violence. Guerrillas would raid their town at night, dragging people from their homes and killing them. Escobar's father once saved their kids by hiding them under a bed, covering them. Unable to break in, the attackers set the house on fire. The army's arrival spared them, but they found bodies in the streets and lampposts on fire. While Escobar excelled academically in his early years and helped friends with homework, his interest in school waned as he got older. His educational achievements remain unclear, with some saying he finished high school, while others claim he was expelled. Author Mark Bowden suggests he dropped out but later returned. Unfortunately, he got involved in petty crimes in Medellin during those years. Older than his classmates and street smart, he often acted like a bully and clashed with teachers, eventually leading to his expulsion. It was during his teenage years that he embarked on a path of criminal activities. His initial unlawful ventures included the sale of counterfeit diplomas, which then expanded to the fabrication of report cards, the smuggling of stereo equipment, and the theft of tombstones for resale. Escobar also engaged in car theft, an offense that led to his first arrest in 1974. Soon after, he ventured into the world of drug smuggling, and by the mid-1970s, he played a key role in establishing the criminal organization that later developed into the notorious Medellin Cartel. During its peak, the Medellin Cartel held an iron grip on the cocaine trade, raking in a staggering $420 million every week. This immense wealth catapulted its leader into the ranks of the world's wealthiest individuals. With an estimated fortune of $25 billion at his disposal, Escobar indulged in opulent extravagances, including private jets, residences, and extravagant soirees. In the late 1980s, he even purportedly offered to wipe out his country's $10 billion debt in exchange for immunity from extradition. Moreover, during his family's fugitive years from 1992 to 1993, Escobar is said to have burned $2 million to keep his daughter warm. Nevertheless, despite his best efforts, Escobar found it impossible to deplete his colossal wealth. Much of it was stashed away in warehouses and fields. According to his brother, approximately 10% or $2.1 billion was written off each year, either devoured by rats, eroded by the elements, or simply lost. The Medellin Cartel, Pablo Escobar, also known as El Patron, entered the cocaine trade in the 1970s, co-founding the Medellin Cartel alongside the Ochoa Vasquez brothers, Jorge Luis, Juan David, and Fabio. Initially, the Ochoa brothers were the business brains of the operation, while Escobar oversaw protection. However, he later emerged as the undisputed leader. During the 1980s and early 1990s, at the height of the Medellin Cartel's power, Escobar controlled almost the entire cocaine supply chain. The cartel imported coca leaves from Peru and Bolivia to Colombia, where it was processed into cocaine in secret jungle labs. The drug was then stored in Colombia before being flown to the United States for sale. At its peak, the cartel supplied over 80% of all cocaine entering the United States, equivalent to around 15 tons per day. Escobar mainly focused on selling cocaine abroad, not in Colombia. He used a secret route in the Caribbean to get it to the U.S. Originally, Pablo Escobar and the Medellin Cartel had a strategic partnership and smuggling arrangement with the Cali cartel leaders Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela and Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela. Medellin controlled the cocaine trade in Los Angeles, while Cali had New York City, and they agreed to share Miami and Houston. However, a personal dispute between Escobar and one of the Cali cartel leaders, Pacho Herrera, led to conflicts over territory in these distribution hubs. By 1988, they had become perpetual enemies, and this feud continued until the demise of the Medellin Cartel in 1993. In the early days of their alliance, the Cali and Medellin cartels had different approaches to dealing with legal issues. The Cali leaders, the Orejuela brothers, preferred corruption as a solution, while Escobar leaned toward violence and intimidation, especially when attempts to bribe officials failed. The Medellin cartel also gained a reputation for not only targeting those who crossed them, but often their immediate family members as well. Escobar believed fear through violence and extortion was an effective motivator, while Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela of Cali believed violence should be a last resort, as it was bad for business. The Cali cartel even required their employees to fill out application forms, including personal information and financial assets, for thorough background checks and security. The Orejuela brothers aimed to appear as the Kennedys of Colombia, while Escobar initially aspired to become the president of the nation. When this failed due to his criminal reputation, he embarked on a nearly decade-long campaign of terror against the government, marked by assassinations and bombings. from 1984 to 1993. During this period, the Medellin Cartel faced kidnappings by guerrilla groups, leading to the creation of a paramilitary group called Death to Kidnappers, or Muerte a Secuestradores, in 1981, funded by the cartel. In the mid-1980s, Escobar strengthened his control over Medellin by establishing a criminal debt collection service known as the Oficina de Envigado in a municipal office in Envigado, his hometown. He used this office to collect debts from drug traffickers and employed hired killers, known as sicarios, to deal with those who refused to pay. Despite his extravagant lifestyle, which included the opulent Hacienda Napoles estate with its own zoo and solid gold dinner sets, Escobar portrayed himself as a populist figure, advocating for the poor through initiatives like public zoos, community soccer fields, and housing projects. Tensions escalated in the mid-1980s when the Medellin Cartel declared war on the Colombian state. Escobar's hitmen targeted politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials. In response, the Colombian government signed into law Escobar's extradition to the United States, leading to a wave of violence. Escobar eventually pushed for the ban on the extradition of Colombian nationals in the 1991 Constitutional Assembly. He negotiated his surrender and stayed in a jail known as the Cathedral, which he essentially controlled. However, his influence within the cartel waned, leading to resentment when he imposed a tax on members. Escobar was also known for ordering the killing of police, judges, politicians, and journalists, but he had friends in law enforcement and the courts who protected him. He made more money by forcing other drug dealers to pay him every month while he was in prison. Escobar liked to spend his drug money on fancy things like art and big houses. He even hid lots of cash in secret places, like burying it on his farms and hiding it under the floors of his houses. In July 1992, Escobar's men discovered a $20 million stash on property belonging to cartel member Fernando Galeano. Escobar summoned Galeano and another associate, Gerardo Moncada, for a meeting at the Cathedral, where both were killed by his sicarios. President Cesar Gaviria ordered Escobar's transfer to a military base in Bogotá, but he escaped before the move. Escobar's former associates collaborated with the government to dismantle his empire. Ultimately, with dwindling resources and just one bodyguard, Colombian authorities gunned down Escobar on the rooftop of a house in Medellin on December 2, 1993. Medellin had a lot of killings because of its involvement in the cocaine trade. It had the highest murder rate in the world when Escobar was around. Escobar as a hero. When he was a young boy, Escobar dreamed of becoming Colombia's president. While many children have similar dreams, Escobar was determined to turn his dreams into reality. As much as Escobar enjoyed his drug empire, he knew that to reach his ultimate goal of becoming the president of Colombia, he needed to dive into politics. But he understood that he had to start small and build his way up. To achieve this, he realized he needed the support of the people. And what better way to gain their favor than by returning to his roots in the community where he grew up? Escobar knew that winning over his own community would give him a significant advantage in the political arena. So he decided to give back to the people who raised him. He helped build new homes, pools, and stores for the community, and he generously gave money to those in need. One of his most famous acts was renovating a rundown recreational center, capturing the hearts of the people. He became a beloved figure, worshipped by the community as a saint who had risen from nothing to greatness. Escobar tried to win the favor of regular Colombians by doing good things. People liked him so much that he was elected to Congress in 1982, but 2 years later, he had to quit because people found out about his crimes, and the justice minister leading the charge against him was killed. The real puzzle revolves around Escobar's undeniable kindness to the local community. During his career, he gave generously to the Colombian people, building schools and sports fields, donating to charity, and creating homes for the poor. People adored him. He symbolized one of them, someone who had risen to challenge their wealthy oppressors. However, it's crucial to understand that not every Colombian saw him as a hero like Robin Hood. For writer Bernardo Aparicio Garcia, his childhood memories of Colombia during Escobar's reign were devoid of romanticized images of thriving communities and beautiful soccer fields. His memories were mostly about fear and his father's unwavering morals. My dad despised the drug traffickers, and to the extent that he could do so without getting shot, he was intolerant of any social interaction that might legitimize their place in society, Garcia recalled in an article about those days, also speaking of the relief he felt when Escobar was killed, comparing it to the defeat of Satan. For some Colombians, Escobar's acts of violence overshadowed any acts of generosity. Arguably, his most shocking attack on the government was the Palace of Justice siege in 1985, in which he allegedly supported the M19 guerrilla group in attacking the Supreme Court of Colombia and destroying evidence against him. Dozens of soldiers and judges were killed. Beyond that, there's no clear figure to indicate just how many hundreds or thousands of people were killed in the interest of Escobar's empire. What is clear, however, is that dealing with death came easily to him, and this is the bottom line in any debate about his apparent good deeds. At best, Pablo Pablo's generosity towards the Colombian people could be seen as an attempt to make amends for the atrocities he committed. At worst, it was a tactic to gain adoration and support from ordinary people to better protect and advance his interests. As Javier Peña, one of the DEA agents who tracked down Escobar, said, "People loved him and that often got in our way. Many in Colombia looked up to him as a god, but he was just a master manipulator." But to his family, Pablo Escobar was a warm and loving man. In fact, his son Juan Pablo said in an interview, "I was willing to give my life for him. That's how deeply I loved him." Despite the violence and criminality associated with his father, he spoke of a deep love for him and the warmth he experienced within the family. Their life on the run, facing constant threats and living in poverty did not diminish his affection. When asked if there was any hatred towards his father, he firmly denied it. Escobar's dark side. There were also contradictions in Pablo Escobar's kindness. According to Escobar's son, "My father's life is full of contrasts and paradoxes. He built sports fields so that young people didn't use drugs, but he financed them with drug money. As a son, I have the best memories of him as a father and the worst of his violence." Juan Pablo often told his father that he didn't like the bombings, kidnappings, and killings because he knew the violence would harm their family. Escobar thought that using violence and threats was an effective way to make people afraid and do what he wanted. Escobar's Medellin Cartel was notorious for kidnapping influential figures like politicians, journalists, and even children. Their cruel actions shook Colombia. In 1990, they kidnapped the son of a presidential advisor in retaliation for a government crackdown. More kidnappings followed, including future Education Minister Maruja Pachon Castro and journalists Francisco Santos Calderon and Diana Turbay. Tragically, Turbay lost her life during a police rescue. Even those close to Escobar lived in fear. For 6 years in the 1980s, a TV reporter named Virginia Vallejo was romantically involved with Escobar. Even though she was initially drawn to him, she eventually saw him as a monster. Her change of heart came when Escobar shared a horrifying story with her. One of his former lovers, most likely Wendy Chavarriaga Gil, became pregnant without his consent. In response, Escobar had her abducted by 4 of his associates and took her to a veterinarian to forcibly terminate the pregnancy. The abortion was allegedly performed without anesthesia, and Escobar then ordered her to be killed. This gruesome act led Vallejo to contact the authorities just 6 days before Escobar's death. Escobar was also linked to the death of presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán. He openly opposed both the Medellin Cartel and Pablo Escobar. He not only criticized them in his campaign speeches, but also advocated for an extradition treaty to send cartel members to the U.S. for prosecution. This stance angered the cartel, leading to numerous death threats against him. They even threatened his children if he didn't cease his efforts. Despite being warned by authorities not to visit Soacha while campaigning, Galán defied the warnings. Tragically, he was assassinated in front of 10,000 people while preparing to deliver a speech. On November 6, 1985, the guerrilla group M19 laid siege to the Palace of Justice in Bogotá, leading to destruction and over 100 deaths, raising suspicions of cartel involvement. Escobar's son claimed he funded M19 with $1 million, supported by Virginia Vallejo's testimony. On November 27, 1989, Avianca Flight 203, carrying 107 people, was en route from Bogotá to Cali. Pablo Escobar believed that presidential candidate Cesar Gaviria might be among the passengers, so he devised a plan to blow up the plane. Allegedly, one of his associates boarded the aircraft with plastic explosives, positioning themselves above the fuel tank to create a massive explosion. Tragically, the plane did explode, resulting in the loss of all lives on board, and falling debris claimed the lives of 3 more civilians on the ground. However, Escobar later learned that Gaviria was not on the plane. Gaviria eventually became the president. Following this incident, which also resulted in the deaths of 2 Americans, President George Bush Sr.'s administration intensified efforts to apprehend Escobar. Escobar's reign of terror included bombings and the deaths of countless police officers. He ordered the assassination of those who opposed him and maintained a reign of violence that scarred Medellin. Fearing extradition to the U.S., Pablo Escobar's Medellin Cartel and allies formed the Extraditables. They started with ads and political manipulation, but soon turned to extreme violence, including bombings in 1990 and the destruction of the security department's headquarters a year earlier. Corruption within the police force allowed Escobar to offer large sums of money to his hitmen for killing police officers. This led to the deaths of nearly 600 officers. Estimates suggest that Escobar and his cartel were responsible for 4,000 to 5,000 deaths. Their methods included ordered assassinations, incentives for killing police, and numerous bombings. Medellin, once one of the world's most violent cities, saw a decline in crime after Escobar's death in 1991. Escobars Death. "I would rather have a grave in Colombia than a jail cell in the U.S." Pablo Escobar's words would soon turn into a reality, catching the drug kingpin off guard. In 1991, Escobar proposed surrendering to authorities with a unique condition. He wanted to construct his own prison. Colombian officials accepted his offer. The result was the opulent La Catedral. This facility not only boasted amenities like a nightclub, sauna, waterfall, and soccer field, but also featured modern conveniences like telephones, computers, and fax machines. However, when Escobar brutally tortured and killed 2 cartel members at La Catedral, officials decided to relocate him to a less accommodating prison. Before the transfer could happen, though, Escobar executed a daring escape in July 1992. Just 24 hours before these photos, no one knew where Pablo Escobar was. He had been on the run for 16 months, and authorities feared they might never catch him. In 1993, the world was eager to see the end of Escobar. He was wanted by the United States, rival cartels, Colombian authorities, and even a vigilante group, but there was a problem. No one knew where he was hiding. In his final 24 hours, an unexpected turn of events would lead to his demise, but it was a fateful mistake that would lead to his downfall. So, why did the king of cocaine make such a critical error? Escobar had been on the run for a while, trying to evade extradition to the U.S. He had committed numerous atrocities, and his enemies were closing in. His family, who were being held hostage by the government, had to flee the country, leaving him alone. On December 1st, 1993, Pablo Escobar woke up alone on his 44th birthday. His previous birthdays had been extravagant, filled with Michelin-starred food, escorts, and his favorite soccer players. But now he was alone, living in fear in his aunt's safe house in Medellin, Colombia. Escobar marked his 44th birthday, purportedly celebrating with cake, wine, and marijuana. Despite his crimes, Escobar cared deeply for his family. He attempted to reach out to them as they faced uncertain danger. The situation was tense, and a ticking time bomb hung over his family's safety. On the morning of December 2nd, Pablo had a simple breakfast of spaghetti cooked by his aunt. Then he decided to make a phone call to his family, even though he knew their phones were being monitored by authorities. The police recognized it was Escobar because he was talking to his son, Juan Pablo Escobar. It seemed like Escobar knew they were onto him because he ended the call abruptly. The call was intercepted by the Search Block, a Colombian super army group, and the DEA. They quickly pinpointed his location. The Search Block, a Colombian government unit, was closing in on Escobar, aided by a deadly group called Los Pepes, sponsored by rival cartels. Los Pepes used ruthless methods to hunt down Escobar's associates, and their actions pushed Escobar to seek refuge alone. The Search Block located Escobar's hideout, and a deadly showdown began. Escobar's bodyguard, El Limon, fled, but was killed. Pablo attempted to escape to a side street, but he was cornered on the rooftop and opened fire on the officers. They returned fire, and Pablo was hit multiple times, eventually collapsing on the rooftop. Pablo Escobar, once the most powerful and feared drug lord, was now lying wounded on the rooftop, his reign of terror finally over. Pablo's call was a crucial mistake. Officially, Escobar's death was attributed to a gunshot from a Search Block member. However, some claim he may have taken his own life. His son, Juan Pablo Escobar, suggested that his father was aware of the phone surveillance and had taught him how to commit suicide discreetly. The gunshot wounds on Escobar's body included one to the right ear, consistent with what he had taught his son. "My father always told me that he had 15 bullets in his pistol. 14 were for his enemies and the last one for him," Juan Pablo Escobar said. From Juan Pablo to Sebastian, Escobar's son, originally named Juan Pablo Escobar Henao, now goes by Sebastian Marroquin. Despite having a family and a successful career, the shadow of his father's dangerous reputation still lingers. Following Pablo Escobar's death in 1993, Juan Pablo Escobar Henao, his mother, and his sister Manuela Escobar left Colombia. They initially sought refuge in Mozambique and then traveled to Argentina on tourist visas. Eventually, they became citizens in exile in Argentina. Juan Pablo decided to adopt the name Sebastian Marroquin from the telephone directory as he needed a new identity. Airlines had refused to sell tickets to him under the Escobar name, as he mentioned in an interview with Skavlan. Despite generating income from the rights to Pablo Escobar's name and image, such as selling clothing featuring his likeness and attempting unsuccessfully 3 times to trademark the Escobar name as a brand, Marroquin prefers not to be associated with his father. He explained in an interview that after his father's death, they received no assistance and faced death threats, compelling them to change their identity for safety reasons. He is committed to distancing himself from the Medellin Cartel and Colombia's illegal drug trade. Marroquin earned an architecture degree from college and currently resides in Palermo, Soho, Buenos Aires, with his wife and son. He works as an architect and has had meetings with some of his father's victims. Marroquin has revisited Colombia twice, once to pay his respects at his father's grave, and another time for the premiere of a documentary. However, he was not granted access to Hacienda Napoles, Escobar's former estate covering 20 square kilometers or 7.7 square miles, located 180 kilometers or 110 miles east of Medellin. The Colombian government confiscated it after Escobar's death, and it is now managed by the municipality of Puerto Triunfo as a public park, campground, and museum showcasing Escobar's crimes. For many years, Marroquín opted to stay out of the public eye and lived a private life. He resides in Buenos Aires and pursues a career as an architect and writer. In 2014, after confronting his past, he decided to step forward and wrote a book titled Pablo Escobar, My Father. Marroquín, after many years of remaining silent, has chosen to reveal details about his relationship with his father and the reasons behind his decision to break his silence. He expresses that the extreme violence associated with his father's actions was a significant factor that led him to distance himself from the path his father had taken. Marroquín believes that the level of violence perpetrated by his father surpasses even what one might see in a Quentin Tarantino film. Marroquín explains that he now feels a duty to tell the truth about Pablo Escobar, as he believes that the glorification of his father's image has led to distorted stories that are not accurate. He believes that TV series and movies have not fully captured the extent of his father's cruelty. His motivation for revealing the truth is not personal gain, but rather a desire to present an accurate portrayal of his father's actions, which he believes is even more damning than the way it's portrayed in films. Marroquín reflects on the contrast between the good and the violence in his father's life. Marroquín emphasizes that he refuses to glorify his father in his books and aims to portray the truth about him, setting his work apart from others that may romanticize Escobar's life of crime. And, regarding his father's death, he revealed that his father had a deliberate plan to shoot himself in the head to evade capture. In an interview with Sun Online, he said, "I have the absolute certainty that my father committed suicide. He thought Escobar shot himself to protect his family from being kidnapped by his enemies, like the vigilante group, Los Pepes." Marroquín has made efforts to separate himself from his father's legacy and has extended apologies to the children of those who were victims of his father's ordered assassinations during his time as El Patrón del Mal. His main focus is on preventing the next generation, including his son Juan Emilio, from repeating his father's errors. Want some more revelations? Click the card on the screen for more stories like this.